the reason it seems to work is that it triggers the same bonding mechanism in the brain as all the other behavioral mechanisms we use in creating our friendships and bonded relationships with each other.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. Robin Dunbar is professor at University of Oxford. He's an evolutionary psychologist, evolutionary anthropologist, and primatologist. He's the author of over 400 scientific articles, author or editor of over 20 academic books, and author of another dozen popular science books. He is widely known for his seminal work on the social brain, human encephalization, and of course, the famous Dunbar's number. His most recent book, published in 2021, is titled Friends, Understanding the Power of Our Most Important Relationships. And today he'll be talking about his chapter in the upcoming volume on evolutionary psychiatry regarding the social function of alcohol from an evolutionary perspective. So Robin, thank you so much for joining me. It's a fascinating topic, and I'm sure the listeners will be really interested in this. So you give this really interesting insight into the flip side of alcohol use that many of us are very familiar with, but which is certainly less prominent in academic and especially health-related discussions. This idea that alcohol use actually has upsides, especially in the social domain. So could you quickly talk about human and also primate use of alcohol and its historical role in evolution?
The historical story is fairly simple, actually. We share uniquely with the African great apes. So that's, excludes the orangutan and the gibbons and absolutely everybody else in the primate family. We share with them the capacity to detoxify alcohol and turn it back into usable energies, basically sugars. And that seems to have arisen around 10 million years ago or so in the African great ape lineage during the time of contraction of the forests in Africa and competition with monkeys for access to fruit. And what seems to have happened is the great apes found an awful lot of fruit lying on the ground, rotting, where monkeys didn't go down to eat it. And the rotting component was essentially created fermentation and produced alcohol. So eating these sort of rotting fruit on the forest floor gave them access to a hugely important source of energy and proteins and so on. And that saved those genera that could do that, principally the ancestors of the gorillas and the chimpanzees, the extinction that the rest of the great apes and lesser apes in pretty much everywhere in the old world faced around that time. The huge extinction rates for these species were being replaced by the monkeys. And of course, we inherit that ability from them. It's not the case necessarily that the great apes sort of go around drinking an awful lot of alcohol in nature, although they actually like it when they do find it, but it's usually human sources for that. But actually rotting fruit has about the same alcoholic content as beer, something around 3 to 4%, something like that. But it seems that capacity to detoxify alcohol and turn it back into sugars has been with us for a very, very long time. Although exactly when we started to manufacture it for ourselves, as opposed to just eating rotten fruit, is a good question and one we can't really put a figure on. We certainly know that there are suggestions that humans were fermenting honey to make an alcoholic drink sometime around 60,000 years ago or so, something of that order. But it's clear that actually kind of industrial scale production of the kind that you might use for parties or big celebrations didn't really occur until probably about 6 to 8,000 years ago in the Neolithic, mainly because you have to be static for that and living in a settled village, and you need big containers, and those really didn't appear until well into the Neolithic. But even so, that's sort of, I don't know, 6 to 8,000 years of experimentation with the production of different kinds of essentially wines and beers.
It's a good reason to begin agriculture, I suppose. It's to get some drink around. Well, obviously, the food is useful as well.
It has been seriously argued by the archaeologists in the last decade or so that the kinds of grains that were first domesticated, these very early ancient barleys and wheats, were not very good for making bread. They weren't very glutinous, but they made an extremely good mash, and that would have, lent itself to fermentation of a sort of beer, wine nature.
So yes, throughout the chapter, you make very clear what is quite obvious to us, that there's these harmful sides to alcohol overuse. But yes, you also really do, bring to light the benefits of moderate alcohol consumption, and especially its role in human social life and on health. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
I think the general perception, of course, is that alcohol loosens the tongue and makes you more voluble and social in modest quantities, and perhaps overly social and voluble in larger quantities. But actually, the reason it seems to work is that it triggers the same bonding mechanism in the brain as all the other behavioral mechanisms we use in creating our friendships and bonded relationships with each other. Now, those are things like physical touch, patting and stroking and cuddling and so on. Behaviors like laughter, singing, dancing, telling emotional sob stories. All these trigger the endorphin system in the brain, and it's the endorphin system that creates the sense of bonding. There's the kind of relaxing and calming and opiate-like effects that you get from endorphins creates a sense of trust and warmth towards the people or person you're doing any of these activities with. And it turns out that alcohol actually is an extremely good trigger of the endorphin system. And so it seems to us anyway that it has just become part of that sort of complex, that toolkit, if you like, of social activities we use on a daily basis for creating these social bonds that we need both to create friendships, but also through those to create bonded social communities with people we perhaps don't engage with on such an intimate level as we would our kind of close friends and romantic partners and family members, as it were. In other words, it allows us in effect to groom virtually at a distance without actually having to touch somebody, and therefore producing this sense of belonging to the same community. And those turn out to have additional benefits on top of that, which were kind of unsuspected, but it's turns out to be the case that the endorphins trigger the release of natural killer cells from the immune system, the white cell system, and obviously those have a huge positive effect on your general physical well-being and health. Natural killer cells are targeting specifically viruses and certain cancer cells in their sort of seek and destroy role. But of course, in addition to that, the endorphins are giving you this opiate or opioid lift that is part of that opioid experience, if you like, and that, dare I say it, is probably the best antidepressant drug you can get, and it's free to boot. It's part and parcel of the system of building bonded relationships, and the endorphins give us this lift and make us feel happier and more contented and more satisfied with life in general. So, alcohol's feeding into that. But again, I think as with almost anything in biology, it's modesty pays. Overindulgence simply tips you over the other end of the curve, as it were, and down back to ground zero. In just the same way as practically any nutritional element does. A little water is good for you, too much water is bad. A little salt is good for you, too much salt is bad for you, etc., etc.
Right. Yeah. So that's the other sort of evolutionary perspective on alcohol use is, recognizing how we have insane quantities of alcohol and in extremely high strengths, which are, evolutionarily novel. So perhaps people wouldn't have been able to, have this. Yeah.
But I think it's absolutely the case that, as with, sort of the well-known effects of overeating and eating too rich a diet, these are, circumstances of civilization, if you like, or consequences of civilization, where we actually can have or can produce very large quantities of food or drink or whatever it may be, and put ourselves in that kind of position. In the normal course of life as a hunter-gatherer, you'd probably be lucky to have half a glass of beer a week. But
yes, yeah. Okay, so it's a really interesting perspective. What do you think are the main messages for clinicians, but also for the general public? How should we think about alcohol and alcohol use, given this perspective?
Well, like all things, it's a matter of degree. Most of these things in real life are good for you. A little exercise is good for you. A little food is good for you. A little drink is good for you. It really is overindulgence that's the problem, and we have to learn to handle that side of overindulgence better, I think, than we do. And the problem is how we do that. I mean, if you look at obesity, sort of governments have spent tens of millions of dollars over the last decades in advertising campaigns to persuade people not to eat so much and to be slimmer, and it really hasn't worked at all. That's partly because it appeals to things that are far too long distance and in one's life, the future. We're not very good at taking notice of or worrying about things that happen too far into the future. We worry much more about things in the present. But so I think somehow there's better ways of persuading people not to overindulge, but it needs to be done at a behavioral level, not at a kind of legal level, I think.
Interesting. Fascinating stuff. I'm sure that everyone will be really, maybe happy to hear that the painting of alcohol as this evil thing is probably not correct. And yes, in moderation, all things in moderation. Thank you so much for this. The chapter is really interesting, and I can recommend it to anyone. And also your work. I think the book, your book on alcohol was released in 2019, was it?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's also an excellent work. And Edward Slingerland recently did a book, I guess, following up on yours. So it's nice to see this perspective really breaking into the mainstream. So thank you for that.
A great pleasure.
Cheers.